Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back, and I hope you're doing well today. I'm Marion and I make classic literature book reviews along with book reviews of other kinds of literature, both contemporary and older literature that may have fallen a bit out of classic status. And today I'm going to be talking about a very famous novel, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And I'm reading this with my husband this summer and thought I would do some little installments because I find these days I read a lot slower than I used to, and I just enjoy taking my time with books and really thinking about each passage, especially with these older books where there's almost a translation you have to do to think about what it meant at the time, maybe look at the endnotes and so on. So yeah, I'll be going through this very slowly. This will just be a little short video about the first 8 chapters because that's where I'm at. And yeah, I'll start by just kind of sharing my history with the book and my reasons for reading it again this year. So I first read Wuthering Heights when I was about 12 or 13, and by that time I'd already been reading classics regularly. I started with Oliver Twist or Great Expectations, one of those, and some of the children's classics like The Secret Garden, and was really into Charles Dickens. I found Jane Eyre and absolutely loved it. So at this point of my life, I was trying to read more of the Bronte sisters and like everyone else, I think, expecting it to be very similar to Jane Eyre, like some kind of gothic romance, which, as has been much spoken about, especially in recent times, Wuthering Heights is not exactly a romance. But that's my background. I read Wuthering Heights when I was 12 or 13. I've read it 2 or 3 times as a teenager, and I have to confess I did not fully understand it, and that's kind of unusual. I think even if I didn't understand all the language, I would usually follow the plots and characters of 19th century literature pretty easily. But this book in particular really stumped me. I think that's why I read it a couple times, and I didn't like it. I thought the drama was gripping, but I didn't like the characters. I thought it was an awful book, and because I was looking for romance, I had these particular expectations that weren't met. So that's, that was my first impression of the book. Had no desire to reread it, except in the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years as I've been getting into BookTube, and I think I wanted to try it again because I've heard so many good things about it. My sister actually loves this book, and I just wanted to try it again and, think about what I might have missed. So, long preamble there, but I have a history with this book. It's not a positive history, but I just wanted to go into it, and pretty much fresh. It's been quite like a couple of decades since then. So, all right, let's talk about, when was this published for starters? So this was published in 1847. What I didn't realize about Wuthering Heights as a child is that it is historical fiction, and it is, I would say, Gothic historical fiction. It has a lot of those elements even in the early chapters with apparitions and this sort of vague sense of brooding dread. Even when the narrator arrives at his landlord's property, the narrator is confronted by a pack of dogs, and if you've read Dracula, you might be thinking back to when Jonathan Harker arrives at Dracula's castle and, the wolves, right? Now, this is not, dogs aren't wolves, obviously, but this really seems to use some of those tropes and, not in a really self-conscious way, but actually just kind of, it naturally weaves into the story. So yeah, historical fiction. This takes place about 46 years earlier. The narrator shows up on the scene in 1801, and he has taken up, I believe it's called Thrushcross Grange. So he's taken on living at this property. The landlord is Heathcliff, and he visits Heathcliff at Heathcliff's home, because they're not living in the same home. But Heathcliff owns this vast property and fortune, and the narrator meets him, and our narrator is an interesting fellow. He is, I think he's good at reading the room, but he's really desperate for company, so he tries to befriend Heathcliff anyway. Doesn't go too well, and ends up finding himself in a very uncomfortable situation, in a very uncomfortable household. But yeah, so he meets the housekeeper, I guess, at Thrushcross Grange, and her name is Nellie. And Nellie is sort of the primary narrator from this point, because in her we get these flashbacks to when Heathcliff was a boy, and Heathcliff's origin story as a transient child who was picked up off the streets by this old Mr. Earnshaw, the man that Nellie used to work for. So old Mr. Earnshaw sees this child in the streets and brings him home, and it really upsets his two children, especially the boy, Hindley. Hindley is older than Heathcliff and gets very jealous that his father has adopted and dotes on this street urchin, right? Like, that's kind of the way they perceived Heathcliff, and much worse. We'll get to that. Yeah, so we have quite a range of narrators, 2 narrators already, a range of characters with very similar sounding names. Kind of reminds me of a Russian novel at times. It's hard to keep track of, and that's one thing I struggled with as a 12-year-old. The names are all very similar, even between generations. There's even some repeated uses of the same name. And in addition to that, I think that Wuthering Heights isn't totally linear, because you've got these flashbacks and different things going on. So, you know, all that together makes it tricky to follow. I did look up a family tree when I started reading this time, and that helped a lot. So recommend the family tree. Maybe I'll put it on the screen if I can find one that's, or I'll just credit where I got it from. But here you can see, you know, the family. And I don't know if this is spoilers. I would assume most people have read this book by this point, or have read it recently because of the new movie. But yeah, hopefully not a spoiler. But yeah, this will be a series of book reviews, so there will be plot spoilers as we go, but only when I get to that part of the book, of course. Alright, so this book is very violent up front, and I think it really surprised me. And I know that Wuthering Heights is famously violent, but I've just read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall back around Christmas time, and that book is going for what would have been modern realism, right? So Anne Bronte takes her time building up this horrible story about a woman suffering from domestic abuse, but she really guides her reader through it gently, and knows that large parts of her audience will be hostile to this woman's story. And that was indeed the case. In spite of her very well-crafted story, there was still a lot of backlash when she published it. Emily Bronte does not do that. She just goes for it here. In the other Bronte sisters, you'll see the D word dashed, you know, like D dash. No. She just brings out the language. The stronger language is dashed, you know, obviously for publication reasons, but she's not holding any punches here, and is really getting us straight into this dysfunctional, abusive family, which is currently lorded over by Heathcliff, who himself had a very, very dysfunctional and abused life. So I think this is, again, where the historical fiction aspect is important. It reminds me of other Gothic literature I've read. There was a book called Wyland by Charles Brockden Brown, an American author, which is also pretty violent. I think he actually wrote it in the late 1700s. I think for him it was a contemporary book. But, you know, Emily Bronte is harkening back to this pre-Victorian time and pre-Victorian moral code, if you will. And I think that's important context for why the book is as gritty as it is. Alright, so I've read, as I said, up through chapter 8, and it's really, really good. It is rough, but it just draws you in immediately. I think because it starts with these child characters, and a lot of Victorian books start with child characters. You know, many great classics. Well, I mean, I already mentioned Oliver Twist and Great Expectations, but Jane Eyre even starts when Jane is a child. So, you know, this is key for some of these authors, is showing the whole progression of a person and their character development from early years. And with Heathcliff, he's really not done much of a service in a way. You know, he's lifted out of poverty and starvation by Mr. Earnshaw. He's elevated in Mr. Earnshaw's household, and then when Mr. Earnshaw passes away, Hindley, the older legitimate brother, if you will, he, you know, takes advantage of his new position as master of the house to abuse Heathcliff, and he takes away, he had some schooling, he stops him taking lessons from the local curate, and he makes Heathcliff live as a servant ever after. So, you know, living with the servants and not being treated as a member of the family anymore, which is hugely significant. I was thinking so much of like a reverse Cinderella story where, you know, or really though, this is a series of ups and downs, right? So I think I like that the story is not so linear like that. I like that it, you know, takes this character and shows this multiple turns of events, which are in different ways positive, but mostly negative. So, yeah, that's one of the big things that jumps out is just this horrific circumstance that Heathcliff is brought into, and the abuse that Hindley levels at everybody, and especially Heathcliff. And I was thinking a lot about Mr. Earnshaw, the father, and how he hadn't really succeeded in raising his own two children, so he brings in this third child as if it is, you know, filling in for something, I think is how I'd describe it. Maybe I'll have more thoughts on that later. One could do like an entire video about Heathcliff's race, and it's been a huge subject of conversation due to the recent film adaptation and their miscasting of Heathcliff as a white person. I think anyone who's reading these early chapters, and if you read it looking both at language and context, is very clear. He is either Romani or black or some other perhaps mixed race ethnicity, and that's really important because it puts this sort of contextual framing around his being so dehumanized, especially when he's first adopted. In fact, Nellie, the housekeeper, she just calls him an it until he is christened. Heathcliff is the christened name that Mr. Earnshaw gives him. And just the way people subsequently treat him, including the Linton family, the neighbors, they do treat him like less than human, right? And there's just all this assumptions made about him, and indeed, both he and Kathy are very misbehaved children, but growing up in a situation of great neglect and abuse by their older brother, it's kind of understandable why they might act out that way. And yeah, there's not a lot of parenting, a good parenting going on here. That's a very clear message of the book as well. So, yeah, I have to show off this bookmark, by the way. This is a beautiful little tea bag felt bookmark that my sister gave me. Very, very cute. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there. I think there's a lot more I could say about even those early chapters, but I just want to set up the series of videos, and I will share more thoughts in maybe another week or so and just go section by section. But yeah, I've already kind of moved past the childhood of these characters, and a lot of their traits have been established, but there's actually a really solid foundation for why those traits even exist. So yeah, really have been enjoying this reread and can't wait to see where it goes. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.